Howdy folks, and welcome back to War Thunder with the mighty Jingles. I'm on my press account, blagged for me by those fantastic guys and girl over at Clann of Gamers, the community dedicated to promoting EU, UK and Scandinavian gamers and gaming companies. And I thought I'd get things out of the way by starting off with an Me262 video, because this is probably going to be one of the most requested aircraft for me to look at. And it's kind of like the Tiger tank in World of Tanks, and a lot of people start playing World of Tanks because they want to drive a Tiger. And a lot of people are going to be playing War Thunder because they want to try out flying one of these legends. So let's have a look at some of the history of the Me262. The Messerschmitt Me262 Schwalbe, I hope I pronounced that right, but I've almost certainly pronounced it wrong. English word was swallow. It was actually the world's first operational jet-powered fighter aircraft. They started design on it before the Second World War, but they had massive problems with the engines and prevented the aircraft from attaining operational status with the Luftwaffe until the middle of 1944. In comparison with Allied fighters of its day, like the British Gloster Meteor, it was much faster and much better armed, 4 30mm cannons. It was used in a variety of roles, including light bomber reconnaissance, and they even made experimental night fighter versions, but what it was mainly used for was attacking American B-17 bomber formations, and it was absolutely deadly in that role. Me262 pilots claimed a total of 542 Allied kills. The only real counter that the Allies had to its effectiveness in the air was by doing what's happening here, attacking them on the ground while they were taking off or landing. They had problems with engine reliability. I mean, they were highly experimental aircraft. And Allies' attacks on fuel supplies during the late war situation severely reduced the effectiveness of these aircraft as a fighting force. In the end, the 262 actually had a fairly negligible impact on the course of the war, because it was introduced too late and it was deployed in small numbers. But it was absolutely feared by anybody who ever went up against them. The Luftwaffe had all sorts of problems with the engines of these things. They didn't last very long. They had an expected operational lifetime of around about 50 continuous flight hours. Most of the early engines just lasted 12 hours, even with adequate maintenance. A pilot who was familiar with the 262 and its engines could expect around about 20 to 24 hours of life. Changing the engine was intended to require 3 hours, but it usually took 8 to 9 due to poorly made parts and inadequate training of ground crews. Even with one engine out, the 262 still flew very well, with speeds of 450 to 500 km per hour. But the pilots were warned to never fly slower than 300 km per hour on one engine, because the unbalanced thrust would cause serious handling problems. These early turbojet engines actually developed a lot less thrust at low speed than contemporary propeller-driven aircraft, and because of this, low-speed acceleration was pretty poor. It was particularly noticeable in the 262, since early jet engines responded very, very slowly to throttle changes. However, the superior power of the jet engines at high speeds meant that the Me262 enjoyed a much, much greater rate of climb, and used tactically, this gave the jet fighter an even bigger speed advantage in climb than in level flight at top speed. On the 26th of July 1944, the Me262 made history when Lieutenant Alfred Schreiber damaged and intercepted a Mosquito reconnaissance aircraft of No. 540 Squadron Royal Air Force. The Mosquito was allegedly lost in a crash upon landing at an airbase in Italy, although other sources state that it was damaged during evasive manoeuvres and escaped. But whatever was true, it was the first victory for a turbojet fighter aircraft in aviation history. Now, despite Hitler's meddling, he actually wanted to use these things as ground attack aircraft, and a unit was actually designated as a ground attack squadron, but they ended up losing 12 aircraft in a very short period of time, with very, very little to show for it. But it was when these things were put in the sky up against Allied bomber formations that they started to cause massive amounts of trouble. During March 1945, Me262 fighter pilots were able for the first time to mount large-scale attacks on Allied bomber formations. On the 18th of March, 37 262s of JG-7 intercepted a force of 1,200 bombers and 600 escorting fighters. They shot down 12 bombers and 1 fighter for the loss of 3 262s. This ratio of kills to deaths, 4 to 1, was exactly what the Luftwaffe would have needed to make an impact on the war. The only problem was the scale of the success was so small because there were so few Me262s. They actually represented only 1% of the entire attacking force. In 1943 and early 44, regardless of the presence of small numbers of 262s, the United States Army Air Force was able to keep up offensive operations with loss ratios of roughly 5%. In some ways, the speed of the Me262 was actually something of a disadvantage. It was actually so fast that the German pilots had to develop new tactics to attack American bombers. If you were attacking a B-17 in a head-on attack, the closing speed of 320 meters per second was just too high for accurate shooting. Even from behind, the closing speed was too great to use the 30mm cannon to maximum effect. Because the 30mm Mk108 cannon had a short barrel and a low muzzle velocity of around about 540 meters per second, it made it inaccurate beyond 590 meters. So what the Germans did was they came up with the Rollercoaster Attack. What they would do is the 262 was approached from astern at about 6,000 feet higher than the bombers. From about 3 miles behind, they would go into a shallow dive that took them right through the escort fighters. When they were about a mile astern and 460 meters below the bombers, they would pull up sharply to reduce their excess speed, and then when they levelled off, they'd find themselves 1,000 yards astern and overtaking the bombers at about 100 miles per hour. Well placed to attack them. Captain Eric Brown, the chief naval test pilot and commanding officer of captured enemy aircraft flight Royal Aircraft Establishment, tested the Me262. And he had this to say about it. This is a blitzkrieg aircraft. You whack in at your bomber. It was never meant to be a dogfighter. It was meant to be a destroyer of bombers. The great problem with it was it didn't have dive brakes. If you wanted to fight and destroy a B-17, you come in on a dive. The 30mm cannon were not so accurate beyond 650 yards, so you normally came in at 600 yards and would open fire on your B-17. Your closing speed was still high, and since you had to break away at 200 yards to avoid a collision, you only had 2 seconds firing time. Now in 2 seconds, you can't sight. You can fire randomly and hope for the best. If you want to sight and fire, you need to double that time to 4 seconds. With dive brakes, you could have done that. Of course, the pilots wouldn't have traded the speed for anything. And they found that the 262 was actually quite a capable dogfighter, as long as you kept it at high speed, where the engine actually responded to throttle change fairly well and was able to deliver the thrust to keep the thing going at high speed. You just had to resist the temptation to get into turning fights at low altitude and low speed. And in that respect, it seems to have been modelled reasonably well in War Thunder. That seems to be the case that I have found when flying the thing, in my limited experience of it. And it does seem to be the case that as long as you keep the speed up on this thing, you will actually be able to outturn any propeller-driven aircraft that try to engage you in high-speed manoeuvres. It's when you get yourself down to their level, when you bleed the speed off for one reason or another, and you still try to get into turning fights, that propeller-driven aircraft are going to have you for breakfast. Keep this thing fast, and it actually performs very, very well. Now here's something a lot of you may not be aware of. The Allied aircraft that the Me262 pilots were most afraid of, it wasn't the P-51 Mustang, it wasn't the Spitfire, it was actually the British Hawker Tempest. The Hawker Tempest scored a number of kills against the 262s. One 262 pilot said that the Messerschmitt 262's most dangerous opponent is the British Hawker Tempest. It's extremely fast at low altitudes, highly manoeuvrable and heavily armed. Some of the 262s were destroyed with a tactic known to the Tempest pilots as the rat scramble. Tempest would be on immediate alert and they'd take off whenever an Me262 was reported to be airborne. They didn't even try to intercept the jet, but instead they flew towards the 262 and 234 base at Rainer Hopstein. The aim was basically to attack the jets on their landing approach when they were at their most vulnerable, travelling slowly with flaps down and incapable of accelerating. So the German response was basically to build what they called a flak lane of over 150 quadruple 20mm guns to protect the approaches. After 7 Tempests were lost to flak at Rheinhopsten in a single week, the rat scramble tactic was discontinued. Given everything that I've told you about the Me262, how you never want to get this thing turning at low speed, how you want to, if you want to maintain manoeuvrability, keep this thing going fast, it's quite ironic that the 2 single missions available in War Thunder, which you see me playing here, the first one being bounced by a whole bunch of Mark 16 Spitfires while taking off, and here intercepting relief supplies for the 101st Airborne at the Siege of Bastogne in 1944, has got me actually flying the thing at low altitude and low speed, which is kind of ironic. Now the Siege of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge in 1944-1945 it's one of those conflicts that gets passed into legend. due in no small part to the HBO series Band of Brothers, based on the book by Stephen Ambrose. If you haven't seen Band of Brothers, shame on you, go and watch it now. I highly recommend you read the book as well. Stephen Ambrose sadly has died now, but he's written a whole series of military history books focusing on the Second World War. Band of Brothers is just one of them. Interestingly, the 101st was never actually supposed to deploy to Bastogne in the first place. They were meant to be going to Vermont on the northern shoulder of the Ardennes forest, but they were rerouted to Bastogne, while the 82nd Airborne, because it was able to move sooner, went to Vermont to block the advance of the SS battle group commanded by Joachim Pieper. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, which was in reserve to the north, was also ordered to Bastogne to provide anti-tank support to the 101st Airborne. Obviously, as an airborne division, the 101st didn't have any armour. They arrived late the next evening, and the first elements of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment entered the division assembly area west of Bastogne shortly after midnight on the 19th of December. By 9 o'clock the next morning, the entire division had arrived. The first fighting at Bastogne was actually a combined arms assault by M18 tank destroyers of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion and the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 1st Battalion 101st Airborne. This was actually one of the very few occasions in the whole Second World War where the M18 Hellcat tank destroyer of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion was actually able to use that legendary top speed of 89 km per hour to get ahead of an enemy force, which is ironic because that's the whole point of the design of the Hellcat in the first place. This was one of those few occasions where it was actually able to exploit its design specifications. The attack of the 1st Battalion 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment and the M18s destroyed at least 30 German tanks and inflicted anything from 500 to 1,000 casualties on the attacking German forces. The M18s have been credited with 24 kills in that attack, including several Tigers, and they believe that, in part due to their ability to shoot and scoot at high speed and then reappear elsewhere on the battlefield, they actually appeared to be another vehicle entirely, another unit entirely attacking from a different direction, and made the Germans think that they were being attacked by a much, much larger force than they were. And that is in fact exactly what happened, thanks to the combined efforts of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion with their M18 Hellcats and the 506th Parachute Regiment of the 1st Battalion 101st Airborne Division. A very small force of American soldiers managed to convince the commander of the 2nd Panzer Division that he was being opposed by much, much greater forces, forced him to rethink his attack, pull his tanks back, and gave the 101st the time they needed to dig in and set the stage for the siege of Bastogne, when, if not for those Hellcats, the whole thing could have been over in a week or less. Instead, after 2 days, the 2nd Panzer Division finally continued on its original mission to the Meuse River, and because of its involvement at Bastogne and its failure to dislodge the 101st, they ultimately ran out of fuel and were destroyed by the US 2nd Armored Division and the British 29th Armoured Brigade. Of course, this wasn't all good news for the 101st. The Germans had actually cut all 7 roads leading into Bastogne. They were completely surrounded. They were outnumbered about 5 to 1. They didn't have any cold weather gear. They were low on ammunition, food, medical supplies. Most of their senior officers weren't even there, including the 101st commander, Major General Maxwell Taylor. They couldn't get into Bastogne. It was the worst winter weather in memory, and the surrounded American forces couldn't be resupplied by air. They didn't even have tactical air support due to the horrible, horrible weather. And this, of course, led to one of the most famous quotes of the Second World War, where one of the 101st Airborne is attributed as saying, "The Germans have got us surrounded, the poor bastards." Although probably the most famous quote of the battle came from the acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. When he was sent a written request from the German General Luftwaffe for the surrender of Bastogne, his reply was one word: nuts. Apparently the Germans didn't understand what he meant, and the officer who took the reply back actually interpreted it for them as "go to hell." All of which brings us back here, flying the Me262 in a single mission in War Thunder, intercepting Douglas C-47 Dakotas. This is just a turkey shoot. As the weather clears up around Bastogne and they attempt to resupply the 101st by air. And seriously, putting an Me262 up against Dakota Skytrains, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. The only thing difficult about this mission was that there were just so many of the buggers. They came in 3 waves and you had to shoot all of them down, and if one of them made it over Bastogne, the mission's failed. So this was a fun little outing in the Me262 in War Thunder. Unfortunately, I've left one of the buggers to slip through, and there you go, mission objective failed. And I lost track of how many of them I shot down, but them's the breaks. Fail to take care of your mission objective, you get punished accordingly. So the Me262, yeah, it's... A lot of people had problems with the Me262 in its original incarnation in War Thunder, but patch 1.29 gave it a new flight model, and it seems to perform the way it should. It's horrible at low speed, absolutely horrible, and it should be horrible at low speed because of the compression of early turbojet engines. They were horrible at low speed. But get this thing fast, and it is absolutely amazing. And 4 30mm cannons. Set your gun convergence to 500 meters and just profit on this thing. It is an absolutely incredible aircraft, and those of you flying down the German research line, you're definitely not going to be disappointed when you get this thing. I've had a lot of fun playing it, and I'm sure you will too. As always, folks, watch your 6, and I'll catch you next time.